All right, here we go. Looks like we are live, and we are here to debunk the dodgeball man himself. And this is going to be a ton of fun. Yet another hilarious video with absolutely no substance that Matt we get to demolish. Okay, but before we do, I do want to go through a couple announcements before we get the party started. Okay, so we've got probably within the week, Matt and I have been working on the epic destruction of science denier Aaron Ra himself. We did put out the sneak peek just last week. Got a lot of good feedback, a couple thousand views between the two channels that we have. So the 3-hour full video should be released soon. We're in the final stages of editing, so that's going to be a lot of fun. We're still having Dr. Frank Turek on. Something came up on his end, and we are probably rescheduling for probably the first week of August. I'll also say that for the summer, we're going to have a jam-packed summer. I've been working on some really solid, not only science-based debates, but theological related debates as well, just to kind of mix it up. I know a lot of people have been enjoying those types of topics as well. So we're going to mix it up for the summer, and pretty soon I should have those debates up in the upcoming live stream section. So that being said, tons to look forward to. Also, the first couple of weeks of July will be packed in terms of lectures, presentations. I've been on the phone and emailing back and forth a number of PhDs that are going to come on, and we are going to demolish evolution, abiogenesis, deep time. So the party's just getting started, guys. SFT is just getting started. So anyways, that being said, I want to first point out that the chat, God bless you guys. Thank you so much for the super chat, super stickers, steadfast and easy. See if I can put this up on screen. Got ramen. We want super creation bros. That's what Matt and I are here to do. And oh, here we go, brother. Steadfast and easy. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. God bless. Multiple gender guy. Yeah, he's the pseudoscience man. So he's pretty much he holds to pseudoscience on relatively every single topic you can point to. He's also the one. Okay, we'll give it to him. He's the two-trick pony. Okay, and this was demonstrated in his recent debate with Ken Hovind, where the guy came in with two tricks. The two tricks failed, and he got absolutely decimated on everything flood and Noah's Ark related. So that was a ton of fun. And that being said, Matt, why don't you introduce the topic, brother? What are we debunking tonight?
Well, what Dan did is he decided to take a study that was done by evolutionists. It's a genetic study, and it showed that all life came out of a recent bottleneck. And so Dan got very mad about this because Answers in Genesis found this article and said, well, this is true, except for it's much more recent. And therefore, the bottleneck is actually Noah's flood, and it happened around 4,500 years ago. So Dan says, no, that is not what the study is saying whatsoever. So he made a video on it, and that is what we're going to be touching on today.
Yes, and he is runner-up again, Matt, for the Team Dodgeball Golden Dodgeball Award of 2021. So in the back there in his office, he's proudly showing off his Team Dodgeball Golden Dodgeball Award of 2020. So I'm glad to see that he's happy with that. Looks good in his office there. But
he's still, are you saying he still hasn't challenged Answers in Genesis to go to a live forum and debate Jensen back and forth like he said he wants to?
No, and you're really going to see in this video that once again, what we find are lack of predictions of his own and more repeating of talking points, as you can see here. Substitution rates, not pedigree rates. Genetic entropy is false. Purifying selection. Genetic bottlenecks. Well, we're going to touch on it all. So that being said, why don't we, I do want to point out, though, that I have a playlist in the description box addressing all of his arguments in great detail. Matt, we just did a video recently. It's getting great feedback. Brother Matt Powell also uploaded it. Got a lot of good views there on Simon Dan, where we must have spent 3 hours on the data that confirms independent origins when it comes to mitochondrial E, Y chromosome Noah. We also went into incredible detail on the out of Africa versus out of Babel models. So I definitely recommend checking out those playlists, because we don't want to spend another 3 hours on every single point that we've already discussed, every single argument that we've already debunked of Dan. So definitely check those out for a lot more information too, because we're going to kind of stay right to the point on this video. So that being said, also check this one out. He did a blind rebuttal months ago, and it was an epic fail. Check out that video. It's in the description box as well. You're going to see, as always, a lack of predictions, lack of retrodictions on his end, just pretty well complaining and repeating talking points. So did you want me to get the video going, brother?
Sure. I just wanted to tell everybody too,
Yeah.
like when you watch this video of Science Man Dan and you see us refuting him, you got to realize that he attacked us. We made a refutation video and then he just denied it, ignored it, and ran. So he was like, challenge me, and we did, and then nothing ever since. So you can always go to his channel and say, hey, put your money where your mouth is. Why aren't you replying to this guy's video? Come on. He's just going to make excuses, but just keep on him. Agitate him. Make him do something. He knows he can't do it, though. So.
Well, think about it. His number one guy is Conspiracy Cats. You know, we've already taken on Conspiracy Cats a couple of times. And Simon Dan then knows that he's not going to be able to match up in a video back and forth, as we kind of did. He kind of gave up after one round. Or he may make excuses that, well, your video was, 3 hours long, so I don't have the time to address everything made in that video. But then it's like, okay, let's take 2 hours out and debate the topic. But he'll obviously be exposed for his misrepresentation. So that being said, let me share screen here and share audio. Let me know, brother, how the audio sounds. And once okay, here we go. I got it at 1.5 times speed. We'll let it play for a minute or so. Let me know when you want me to pause it, and we'll make our comments.
And welcome back to Creation Myths. Today's topic is the creation myth. There was a recent and simultaneous origin for virtually all existing animal species. So to introduce this claim, this is based on a 2018 paper by Stokel and Thaler. I'll link that in the description. The claim that creationists make based on this paper is that virtually all animal species appeared at the same time within the last 200,000 years. And that's not what the paper says, but it's up in the neighborhood. And then creationists go on to argue, therefore, recent creation approximately 6,000 years ago. And I'll show you representative of these creationist arguments. So here we have our friend, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson.
I can't even let it play 2 minutes. We're not saying that this study says this was a recent creation event. He is already wrong in strawmanning the argument. This study, from what I'm going to show you right now, because I'm going to share my screen, is this study in particular. It is called, you guys can pull it up as this is going. It is called Why Should Mitochondria Define Species? And what do we say about it? What every study paper that we have says about it. And that is, this was the global flood. That is why it says 90% of species came out of this bottleneck. Notice it doesn't say all of them, like he's saying. You're muted, by the way.
Here we go. Yeah, I was going to say that's an argument we constantly hear. For one, he right off the bat fails because he doesn't understand that we're taking this back to what? The flood bottleneck. This confirms the flood bottleneck, but also the fact that they constantly push. And in a number of debates that I've done, they have pushed that argument that, well, why is it 90% and not 100%? Can you address that, brother?
Right. The reason why is because there was the 10% that got reduced. The world population reduced down to 10%, and then the expansion of all life we see today from that 10%, the animals that were on the ark. It makes sense, right? 10% into the vast majority of all the other 90% of life that we see today. Very easy to explain. When you look at the numbers, what would make more sense when you're looking at something like this? right? You get all those dogs, you reduce them down to the wolf. Well, there you go. There's your 1%. Here's your here's your other percentage. Well, you do that with all the species on Earth. There you have it. That's what we're trying to explain. That was
well, but Matt, what about this? What about this, brother? We got a critic in the chat says 200,000 years is more than 6,000 years. That's a problem for creation. How do we respond to that, since we've heard this one over and over again too? This is one of Dan's main arguments too. So yeah, how do we deal with that, Matt?
That is going to be answered in extreme detail in this. 200,000 years was made up in the study. Completely.
Look at this too.
Oh, great. Another person that doesn't know basics about the thing. Shocker.
There we go.
The same arguments every single day. It's almost like they don't listen or something. But okay, so the study. What is it saying about the time? Well, how come they just throw out a date and they specifically don't talk about how they got that date? It's really, really simple. This study was not to determine when this happened. It was to determine what is related. It's a study on a particular region of the gene called the CO1 gene, and it's a fragment in the mitochondria. So when you're looking at the mitochondria, and you look inside of the cell and you find the mitochondria, and you look over here. Most people test the D loop for mutations and things, but they looked over here and they found the CO1 gene, and they realized that this region ticked extremely fast. So fast that when a new species is created, let's say you're looking at these dogs, and you take, I don't know, what is it, a Shih Tzu or something? And anyway, this dog now is specially bred, and it creates one of these. Okay, well, with DNA barcoding, mutation rate is so quick, you can actually see when this breed arises from this one, and it can differentiate between the two, that nothing else can really do that. So they're using it to tell what species are related to one another based on the mitochondrial mutation rate of that gene. That's what they were doing with the study. That's what they discovered. And they said, oh, wow, look at that. Everything has low average pairwise differences, and everything came out of a recent bottleneck. Everything. So what in the evolutionary model says there was a bottleneck 200,000 years ago even? Okay, let's just say it's 200,000 years ago. Well, that immediately destroys evolution as well, because it's a global bottleneck. They have nothing. Matter of fact, they were so perplexed by this. I'm getting off track because this is not exactly what I thought I was going to be jumping over to, but okay, let's just jump right in. What this study is looking at is DNA barcoding. And as you can see, looking at a bird and a bee, using that CO1 gene region, there's a lot of differences. You can definitely tell these are something non-related to one another. There's a border there. And how could this be possible? If evolution were true, the borders wouldn't really be there, because deep time would have scrambled it. There would be no way to tell. But yet, the mutation rate in the region is so extremely fast. When you look, these are pedigree studies that have been actually done on the CO1 gene right here. And you can see how fast these mutation rates are. But if this was 200,000 years ago with a fast mutation rate, you wouldn't be able to see normal species arising and a mutation and the differences, because the mutation rate would have to be too slow to see a difference over 200,000 years, but it's too fast. So looking at it again this way, we have a human, we have the mitochondria, and then we have the CO1 fragment right here, and then the chimpanzee. So that's what they're looking at. And then they did it with all the different animals. And they went around and they said, wow, look at this. We have a mutation rate that's really quick in this region. And we can differentiate between all of these different things without even knowing what they are. They can literally just look at this fragment and say, oh, that belongs to this animal, this creature. And then they line it up with other ones. For example, when you look at butterflies, you can see the butterfly is very, very similar to another butterfly, totally different species, but yet the mutation rate being fast, this speciated into this one, and yet there is enough mutations to tell, even over a short period of time, that one, they're still related, they're very related, and over a deep time, they would not be so related because the mutation rate's too quick. It would probably look something like the owl would be, but we can tell the owl is completely different than the butterflies by looking at the CO1 gene. So here's the strength of it. They can look at the alternative for taxonomic identification besides just morphology. So when they're looking at morphology, it's too inconclusive. And that's what's wrong with taxonomy. It's all assumption based. They use assumptions, and they admit this. This is directly from Berkeley education. And they said, well, we have 3 basic assumptions when we're building these things. We assume a common ancestor to all life, so they assume it to begin, assume a level of evolution to be true, and then they just go from there. And that's what they did with the CO1 gene. They went to the fossil record and they assumed that the mutation rate is slow based on their fossil record. So it's evolution again to prove evolution. So when they finally did the mutation rate and they saw it, they go, wow, this is extremely fast. But it was ticking something like this, really, really rapidly. And they didn't expect to find that, for one. And then they looked at the cats and they were like, wow, look at this. Cats have different rates of mutation based on the species that they are. So you can have a house cat having a really faster mutation rate than a lion, and then slower than a tiger. We can explain this. Evolution can't, because their model uses something called neutral theory, and they predict that everything balances out when it comes to mutation rates over time. And we have an entirely different thing. So going back to the study, going back to this, why mitochondria should define species, they got the date from actually that was down here. I jumped ahead. I jumped backwards because there was already questions for me to answer that were out of order almost entirely. We can go there, but look, we're not even 1 minute into the video.
Yeah, let's save that because I've got a ton of things that I want to say too. So yeah, one thing I want to ask you before we go to the next part of the video, which we will, did they predict any of this data?
No, absolutely not. And I can prove that with their own words by right here. This conclusion is very surprising, and I fought against it as hard as I could. So it was outside of all predictive things. The absence of in-between species is something that also perplexed Darwin. We'll go down the list and show how this study was a complete paradox to what they believed, and is a complete upset. They expected land life maybe died from a bottleneck, but when they discovered all life on Earth was eradicated just 2,000 years ago, they were completely thrown. And I'll prove it again later with more quotes from the scientists themselves.
So what you're saying is, just like almost everything else, they had to retrofit the data into their story. Just like when we discovered humans have low genetic diversity, they had to invent what?
The bottleneck.
Out of Africa population bottleneck. So it's always retrofitting the data into their story. And that's what they're doing here as well, Matt?
It is. As a matter of fact, it's so much so the case that they've essentially just put that tag on this study. That's where the 200,000 years comes from. What they did is they said, well, 200,000 years ago must have been when this happened. So what did they say about that? Well, they go, this is what we're going to say. We just put it back. And the authors right here state one thing, how shocked they were. They said, all species show the same lack of barcode diversity. Although it is easy to imagine that humans passed through a bottleneck about 170,000 years ago, it's hard to believe that exactly the same thing happened in all species. Did herrings pass through an equally recent bottleneck? Anchovies too? Like, what in the world in their bottleneck it killed aquatic life? Nothing was in their model did. They said, second, there is no trace in the geological record for any global event 200,000 years ago. So they're looking for it. They need to look for it, right? They're running around and they're going, well, it happened because the genetic evidence says it happened, but yet based on our assumption that this happened 200,000 years ago, there's no trace of the event. So that's their problem. They, in their own words, they can't see the obvious. they don't use observable mutation rates. They use their own mutation rate based off the fossil record, which is wrong based on their own comments, their own evidence. They look, no bottleneck, but yet it happened. So what happened? We don't know. Who cares? Oh, it happened.
I fought it as hard as I could because it just sounded too much like the biblical model of ancestry, essentially.
Yes.
All right, here, let me share a little bit more because I know we got so much more to say, but we will try and relate it to portions of the video itself. So here we go. Let me know, guys, in the chat how the audio is. We do have it at 1.5 times speed, just so we're not here all day. I noticed a couple people said it's going kind of fast, but any slower than that, yeah, we'll be here till tomorrow with how much Matt and I like to discuss. So here we go.
From AIG, hundreds of thousands of species in a few thousand years, recent mitochondrial DNA barcoding results bode well for the recent origin of species. And from Don Batten over at CMI, we have recent origin of species, a new DNA study challenges evolution's story. A major study of 5 million DNA barcodes on mitochondria has given some controversial results that fit well with the Bible's history in Genesis. So before we go any further, I just need to point out how bonkers it is the way that both AIG and CMI misrepresent these sources. Both Jensen and Batten just go way out of left field to take the findings from this paper and twist them and contort them into something that they claim supports a young Earth. So we'll start with Jensen here from AIG. He writes, we now have 2 decades worth of direct measurements of the rate at which human mitochondrial DNA mutates, and it matches exactly the 6,000-year timescale and rejects the evolutionary timescale. That is completely bonkers, 100% incorrect. That is wrong. I've talked at length about how Jensen's mitochondrial most recent common ancestor calculations are wrong. To start with, he uses mutation rates rather than substitution rates. You can't do a times most recent common ancestor calculation using mutation rates. It's simply the wrong tool for the job. But it gets better from Jensen. This is frankly amazing. So look at the second paragraph down here. He says, now let's re-extrapolate these results to other species. And then he quotes from the paper. He quotes the authors, except he leaves off the end of the passage. He writes, the simple hypothesis is that, or I should say he quotes, the simple hypothesis is that the same explanation offered for the sequence variation found among humans applies equally to the modern populations of essentially all other animal species. Namely, that the extant population, no matter what its current size or similarity to fossils of any age, has expanded from mitochondrial uniformity within the past, and that's the end of the quote. And what the authors say is within the past 1 to several 100,000 years. What Jensen writes is within the past, end of quote, 6,000 years. That is pretty impressive, even by the standards of AIG and specifically Nathaniel Jensen. Now, if you look over to Don Batten at CMI, he writes,
Okay, so we kind of touched on that. Maybe we should touch on it a little bit more, Matt. So he's saying Dr. Nathaniel Jensen is misrepresenting the paper because he's pointing out, like we do, that all of this diversity can be traced back essentially within 6,000 years, right? And the 4,500-year flood bottleneck would be within that 6,000-year time frame. He's saying it's being misrepresented because they say a couple 100,000 years.
Right.
Is there any validity to what Dodgeball Dan here is saying?
Well, you got to remember that he forgets that all we have to do from our perspective is show that the diversity can be explained with the observable mutation rate that we have. They can assume it with theirs, but can we explain it using what we see? And we can. We have multiple. We don't have just Dr. Jensen down here on the bottom with his prediction of 1 mutation every 33 generations. We have somatic mutations, we have dyads, we have triads, we have pedigree mutation rates, we have substitution rate studies, and clearly that's all we need as far as evidence goes to prove that the diversity we see in humans today is explainable by the young Earth creation perspective. And we can. That's all we need. We only needed one piece of evidence for that, but we have multiple. We have all these, all the way back from the 90s. And in reality, we could have just had one. Jensen just goes to one study, and he does that. And he pulls it out, and he did the math himself. And that's what he came to his conclusion, is that, look, we have this mutation rate. I ran the numbers, and all the mutation rates show that we can get the amount of genetic diversity that we see in human beings today going back 6,000 years based on this mutation rate. He could have used Parsons. He could have used Howells. He could have used anybody's. And really, like I said, all we have to do is explain it. Evolution tries to explain the diversity of all life that we see. They can't do that with mutation rates, so they invented their own called a phylogenetic method. That's fine. They can invent whatever they want. We just look at the observable mutation rate and we go, look at that. We can explain it in a very fast period of time. So what if it's just a few studies? Not everybody mutates the same. When Parsons was looking and investigating the Amish people, they mutated 7 times slower on average. Now, why would that be? Well, based on Dr. Jensen's predictions, he based the African population, when they get tested, that their mutation rate is going to be about twice as fast as the Europeans. Why? Because where they live and they have fast generation times. A lot of them have kids when they're around 15, 16, and 17 years of age. The Amish have kids up until they're 30 and 40, and they can no longer bear children. So they have children much later in age, and that goes exactly along with what Dr. Jensen would have predicted for the African people. His results aren't still in yet, but what Parsons discovered is that humans also have different mutation rates. So if you were testing generations of Amish people who have a slower mutation rate, you'd be like, oh, maybe it doesn't go back just 6,000 years. But you got to remember, Amish people didn't go, they're not coming off the ark. We're testing groups of people, and we're trying to determine, can the mutation rate that we see explain the vast amounts of mutations that are in people today? And yes, it can, because the mutation rate is fast and not a lot of time has passed. How can we have so few mutations with a fast mutation rate if deep time is true? That's why they invoke that it must have been slower in the past with no evidence whatsoever.
And then we showed in our other stream that there's been a recent study showing that the mutation rate is relatively the same in the fact that it's fast in all mammals.
Yeah. I found one just recently. You can see it right here. They studied chickens because, they don't do pedigree studies in very many things. Guess what they found? They show the rate of evolution in the pedigree study is, in fact, 15 times faster. 15 times faster than they expected it to be, based on what? Evolution. So the fast ticking mutations inside the chickens were exactly what we would expect to see if creation was true.
If I could point this out, brother. So a few people in the chat still don't get what we're saying. So we have Marshall here who says, so y'all don't care that they straight up lied about the paper. I thought bearing false witness was frowned upon. No. So they're still not getting it, okay? As you pointed out, the 200,000 year date is not based on what? It's observed mutation rates.
Mutation rate, correct.
The actual genetic data. We have the genetic data, and the authors of the paper are force-fitting it into their story, assuming the geological timescale. When we actually use observed mutation rates, what's the actual date we get, roughly?
On what mutation rates?
On the study that the evolutionists are saying Dr. Jensen misrepresented.
They say this word for word. You can go into the study, and they say this is Karn who actually ran it, and this it was how she did it. She goes, people colonized these regions relatively recently, a minimum of 30,000 years ago in New Guinea, about 40,000 years ago in Australia, and 12,000 years ago in the New World. These times enable us to calculate that the mean rate of mTNA divergence within human lies between 2 to 4-fold % per million years. So basically, they made up their own based on what they say right here about history, linguistics, paleontology, and anthropology.
Calibrating it.
Calibrated. And they did it using what they believe was good evidence. They go into their own fossil record, which they made up, and they said, well, these layers must be old, so we're going to go with that. It's like, wait a minute. How in the world is linguistics helping you determine how old animals died? How is anthropology? How are these things doing it? We're using the observable one. So when the study doesn't focus on age, they assume it. And then Young Earth Creationist comes along and says, well, let's look at what they should have had this date as. Well, let's do it. Let's break down the numbers. They remember that study wasn't focusing on that. They were focusing on what species are related, and can we use DNA barcoding to determine if these are true? And what they determined is DNA barcoding. Like I said, that was the most important thing about the study, is what they say here. 99%, 99999 accurate. So yes, DNA barcoding ended up being extremely, extremely accurate.
And what you're saying too, I'm going to put this to bed too,
Okay.
right here. And what's funny is I've had so many debates where the evolutionists absolutely fail to address this data. And then Dodgeball Dan clearly recognizes this. So he goes into full scale damage control mode with his video where he just repeats the same talking points that have already been debunked. So this whole misrepresenting the paper, I'm just going to see, here's the thing. The evolutionists, they don't read young earth creation technical literature. So Dan takes one quote out of Nathaniel Jeanson's article here, and now the supporters blindly believe what he's saying. No, read the whole paper, because here it is, okay? Hundreds of thousands of species in a few thousand years. Read the paper, and Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson clearly points out the conclusions of the authors, okay, past 200,000 years. Goes here. It's an incredibly detailed article that Dodgeball Dan did not address. And that is why he's absolutely terrified to take someone like Jeanson on in a written debate in the AIG journal. He can't even take us on because he's the two-trick pony, and he hasn't any predictions of his own. So right here, but did the authors never claim that most species came into existence within the past 200,000 years? Okay. And he addresses the data. He addresses the reasons that they put forth for the 200,000 year date and for the uniformity in the genetics, and demonstrates clearly that no, the rescue devices don't work. And the data, the actual empirical data, okay, is better supported by the biblical model of ancestry, because these evolutionists, as you know, Matt, they look at the data, they look at the empirical evidence, and then they blindly believe what? The conclusion of these authors. Same thing goes for a number of lines of evidence. The Y chromosome dissimilarity between chimpanzees and human beings, less than 35% dissimilar. They go find on Google a simple answer that says something like the chimpanzees have had differential, mating histories, right? So they say that was able to change the Y chromosome, even though that doesn't work for a number of reasons that we're not going to get into here. But the point is, they constantly blindly believe the conclusions of the authors rather than using critical thinking skills. Any points there, brother?
No, that's perfect. What they're failing to realize is that we're not really strawmanning these authors. These authors are already unwillingly admitting that there was a global event that eradicated almost all of life. It all went into a bottleneck, and then it came out the other side, and that this evidence shouldn't be there. It's shocking. They fought against it, and then they admitted, okay, well, it must be there. They looked in the fossil record, and it wasn't there. So everything about this was against their predictions, against what they expected to find. They fought against it, and then they had finally had to admit genetic evidence doesn't lie. Our fossil record is lying. What is true? Well, we know, based on DNA barcoding being 99.999% accurate, that all species came out. Now, remember, if you believe in evolution, every living animal that you see in your life existed from just 200,000 years ago. Even in your model, that's unexplainable, because that is far too fast for species to form in the boundaries and limits that you have. Remember, you have things going in to a bottleneck, only a handful, and just a few coming out on the other side. And this is worldwide, killing all fish, killing all birds, killing all land life. And yet, what in your model does that just 200,000 years ago? There's nothing. But yet the genetic evidence says that it is.
So what we have then is the misrepresentations are coming from who? Are coming from the evolutionists.
Right. Exactly.
Not
and that's why the scientists are so confused. That's why the authors are so dumbfounded and put all this in writing. Like, this is bizarre, and I don't know what to do with this. And we're saying the reason why you view it that way is because of your mindset. You went in with the wrong conclusion, and you're trying to fit the conclusion with the paradigm, and it's not working because it's wrong.
Exactly right, brother. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to go play some more of the video, but please, everybody in the audience, okay, for the sake of our sanity, me and Matt, Go read the actual articles or technical papers, so then you can stop misrepresenting the creationist arguments. Okay, so let's go here. And audio, I believe I clicked audio on. So here we go. We'll play it a little bit more. We got some more fun stuff to deal with, Matt. So we're just getting started here. And isn't it funny that this is the best they got, Matt? I think this is why your team dodgeball captain, I guess Dodgeball Dan and Gutsy Gibbon can fight over the captain role, but it's why GG has failed so miserably, because this is who they're looking to for their answers, right? Your Strami Doss, your Dodgeball Dan, they're failing miserably. They're not putting forth testable predictions, and therefore they, which are parroting these arguments from these guys, are left with nothing. And really all we can do is laugh like we're doing here and refute them with the empirical data. So here we go, brother.
Okay.
The authors write as evolutionists and make evolutionary assumptions to get this extended time frame, meaning hundreds of thousands of years. He goes on to say, with some slightly different assumptions about mutation rates, the data would fit neatly with the creation of all organisms about 6,000 years ago. In other words, if we do the math on mutation rates incorrectly, if we do this math the way that Jensen does the math, which is completely wrong, you can't use mutation rates that way. But if we do the math that wrong way, well, wouldn't you look at that? All these same species wind up in the same 6,000 year window as the human mitochondrial most recent common ancestor, which again is based on the incorrect math. So that's the caliber of the arguments coming out of AIG and CMI with regard to this paper. So here's the actual paper. This is a barcoding study, and barcoding is when you characterize species based on a very small part of their, it's usually for animals, it's part of their mitochondrial DNA. It's usually one of two genes, and in this case, they're looking at a single mitochondrial gene, the cytochrome oxidase subunit 1 gene. And what they do for this mitochondrial gene is they calculate the time to most recent common ancestor, TMRCA, for most animal species to within the last 1 to several 100,000 years. That's, by the way, the phrase that Jensen replaced with 6,000 years in that previous quote. So that's, for our purposes today, that's the takeaway here. Now, there's a lot going on in this paper. The authors talk about a lot of stuff. It's very comprehensive. I don't agree with everything they say, but all that is neither here nor there for the creationist claims with regard to this paper. So this is the relevant stuff for the creationist claims here, that we have a single mitochondrial gene, we're doing time to most recent common ancestor calculations across many species, and we find that the convergence point tends to be within the last few 100,000 years. So why are the creationists wrong when they, let's say, interpret the paper this way? Well, first is that it doesn't show the origin of these species within the last 200,000 or so years.
I don't know about you, Matt, but I couldn't look at the screen for that minute there because his screen was doing some pretty wild things there.
Yeah.
Did you have anything you wanted to address there, or should we keep going for a bit?
Yeah, he specifically said, I myself didn't agree with everything that was in the study. He didn't even say what those things were, but I'm guessing. I'm just guessing here. Maybe I'm wrong. Is that probably because everything in the study proves young Earth creation except for their date of 200,000 years. It's literally a global bottleneck killing everything on life, everything, all species that we see today exploding out of that bottleneck and to what we see today. And then on top of it all, no geologic evidence whatsoever to back up what they said the date was for that event happening. So, and then there's genetic boundaries. I mean, literally, there's everything wrong. Let me just screen share real quick because I was thrown off when we did that. I'm not even sure what this is because I didn't mark anything. The agreement of barcoding domain experts implies that explaining the origins and the patterns of DNA barcodes would be a large part explaining the origin of species. That's right. Understanding the mechanisms. So where do these species come from that we have on Earth today? So we look over here and we see namely that the existent population, no matter what its current size, so all the birds, all the species of birds, all the species of fish, no matter what its size or similarity to the fossils of any age, expanded from mitochondrial uniformity. That means that there was a bottleneck because all the mitochondria was reset during that time. They assumed in the past 200,000 years. They're right, it wasn't in the past, but it was a much more recent past. And what they say about it is this is the most data-rich and general facts in all of evolution. So they know that there was a bottleneck. There's no doubt about that. So when we look over here and we're seeing human beings and we see chimpanzees and we see orangutans and we see this is a human being here. What's the minimal mitochondrial diversity in humans? Well, it's very, very low in some people. And then it's very high in others. Right here, we can see that line. This is the maximum diversity when we look at human beings in the CO1 gene. I'm not talking about every region or the D loop or the entire mitochondria. I'm talking about just the CO1 gene. Neanderthals, down here is their minimum, up here's their maximum. They fall directly with what we would expect. Denisovan, minimum, maximum. And then we get into the chimpanzees, huge amounts of diversity within them. Yet, why is that? Why in the world with their okay, we have fast mutation rates and not a lot of time, massive amounts, low amounts when we look at all the humans. Exactly what we would expect to see if this were true. Not evolution. There are borders. There's genetic borders, and we can see it based on these mutation rates. And how do we know we're not just looking at species? Because DNA barcoding goes all the way up to the taxonomic levels of family or class. So it doesn't just work on species. It goes all the way up. And I think I take another screenshot of the same thing here. Yep. And then I show that it's accurate. And then look at that. For the planet, 7.6 billion people, 500 million house sparrows, which are birds, or sandpipers, genetic diversity is about the same. Deep time won't allow that to be true. It can't. So here's from the study itself, looking at elephants and bears, dogs. They've tested so much. You can go to the DNA barcoding study itself and notice that. And then we can read this entire thing because this is great. And yet another unexpected finding from the study, species have clear genetic boundaries, and there's not much in between. If individuals are stars, then species are galaxies. And Thaler, they are compact clusters in the vastness of empty space. The absence of in-between species is something that also perplexed Darwin. So another thing the study is concluding that the evolution did not predict. And they even said that. This is another thing against our predictions. They did not know what to say about this. That's why they fought against this data. They have no conclusion because it doesn't make sense in their model. Why? Because it's not true. And we can look right here. Think about it. I mean, we can move on, but this is Ernest Mayr and proposed in 1942 that a species is a population of organisms that can all interbreed with each other, right? And which either cannot or do not interbreed with anything else. So we see that this has changed now because now they're telling us that species are something that cannot breed with one another. That's how you can identify a species, is they're no longer able to breed. Well, if deep time were true, they would be so mutated and so vastly different that a lion and a tiger would never be able to breed. But in our model, it's no fine because they speciated right after one another. And the speciation event would leave a lot of things very similar to the point where they can breed with one another. But it goes against the speciation definition. But yet all cats can have offspring. Obviously, some can't. You can't get a house cat to physically with a lion. But in vitro, it still works because they're still related. And not a lot of time has passed, even though the fast mutation rate. So we can move on. I just wanted to go over that real quick.
And I want to point out, what is all this genetic data, okay, that sets genetic boundaries in ancestry? It confirms separate ancestry, which is amazing because now we can go in and make predictions, we can make retrodictions, and we can determine what exactly is related and what's not. But the bigger picture, we see separate ancestry, we see genetic boundaries, we also see boundaries and discontinuities in the fossil record, which we'll get into later. We had Dr. Matthew McLean here to demonstrate boundaries in the fossil record when it comes to Dinosauria and the Therapsids. And what's so funny is RJ Downer, that's his favorite topic. You'd think he'd be jumping all over that to refute it. And that discussion we did months ago goes untouched.
Of course.
Beautiful. So here's the thing. What does this say then about, man? I'm curious as to your thoughts. People in the chat, right? Like Andrew Cumming, who puts a lot of effort into these phylogenetic trees, these phylogenies. So when we're then building these trees based on shared derived synapomorphies and various traits and morphology and looking to species trees and gene trees, we can even look at amino acid trees, okay? What does this say about their conclusion, since they assume evolution to prove evolution, and they assume that everything on these trees go back to a common ancestor. They assume universal common ancestry, and they believe that these trees demonstrate that. But you're showing the genetic data actually refutes that. So what does that actually say about their conclusions derived from their phylogenetic systematics exactly?
it just shows us that it's assumption based, and they're not willing to see past it, because just like the authors of the studies, they're fighting against the evidence as hard as they can. But the genetic evidence is telling us one thing and they're saying another, but they're not allowed to do that because they're paid to do these studies. They get government grants. They can lose their jobs. Like, look at what happened to Mary Schweitzer, right? She was afraid for her career. So of course she's not going to say she's a young earth creationist, because her other colleague that said this is young was fired. So it only makes sense that you're going to go, I'm going to find an answer to this, and I don't care. They're just going to accept it. And nobody ever questions what she found. As far as the rescuing device, the iron preservation, nobody said, oh, she's full of it, I'm going to prove her wrong. They were like, oh, good, she got one. She came up with something. That's all they're looking for, is just an answer. They don't care if it's true. So when all the evidence keeps pointing at something, when, if you're saying, oh, this goes back a really long time, but then you look at the evidence and everything is fast, and as far as mutations go, well, it can't be. It's just that simple. You can't invoke a theory that's an assumption about, well, maybe things didn't mutate, or maybe mutation rates were super slow in the past. You can invoke whatever you want, but that's fairy tale. That's nonsense.
And once again, I want to point out from the chat, 0 rebuttals, 0 refutations, 0 predictions, okay? And yet we have here we go with the conspiracy theories. These aren't conspiracy theories. We've already shown quotes where they admit that they assume evolution to prove evolution. They assume ancestry going into their phylogenetic systematics. Okay, so they admit that they assume the bigger picture, but they can question the details. And that's what they do, is they question the details, but they don't question the bigger picture. This isn't a conspiracy theory. They literally admit this. And what's so funny about this whole debate when it comes to ancestry, okay? And you and I, we like to focus on the bigger picture. We like to focus on ancestry. We even like to focus in on human ancestry. We like to go as close to home as possible, right? And that's what I don't like about just hanging out in abiogenesis, because essentially you could, in a way, show the flaws of abiogenesis, but then the evolutionists will just say, well, biological evolution means it changes in allele frequencies and populations over generations, and the biological evidence suggests humans and apes are related, right? But then we point out, no, we can go as close to home as possible, and we can demonstrate through genetic diversity, through mutation rate data, through DNA function, that humans and apes are not related. All you have to do is show one example, right, Matt, of separate ancestry. And what does that do? It completely decimates universal common ancestry, because they assume humans, apes, they would just say, the great apes are non-human apes, because they assume humans are apes. Clearly, humans are not apes if we're showing the genetic data that demonstrates humans and non-human apes aren't related. So the point is that absolutely decimates universal common ancestry, and also decimates origin of life as well. And we have predictions to back that up. So they can make any conclusion they want based on their phylogenetic trees and the assumptions behind their phylogenetic trees. But the fact is, what we see are genetic boundaries. We see genetic boundaries and genetic diversity levels in the CO1 gene through barcoding that is contradictory to universal common ancestry. So I just wanted to point that out, that all we need is one example. We have that with humans. The data suggests they're not related to any other form of life. And we also have that with the discontinuity data in the fossil record, which we'll get into later. And we have that in the diversity data when it comes to DNA barcoding and this genetic boundary study. So no, there's so many reasons why banana plants, whales, humans, and monkeys are not related. And that decimates universal ancestry. So I just wanted to point that out, brother. If you had a couple of points to make, we can go back to the video.
I did. I would love to know how this is a conspiracy theory when Mary Schweitzer said it herself in multiple interviews that she was afraid for her job. I would love to know how it's a conspiracy theory when Mark Armitage was directly fired because he was a young earth creationist saying that this was evidence. I would love to know why you think you would pass Dan's class if he was your teacher, if you were a young earth creationist. What makes you think Dan, who hates the subject, would let you pass his class? How is that science? Science is supposed to be showing contrary conflictions. You should like that we exist and that there's a battle going on, because that's what real science is. Disprove the theory. Don't look for evidence to prove it. That's what evolution is doing. That's why it exists for nothing but retrodictions. That's why it's looking at all of the evidence to try to prove that it's true. And the scientists are going, I'm fighting against this as hard as I can because this doesn't make any sense. That's not a conspiracy. That's reality. And that's what
reality.
That's it.
And one thing I'll point out too, because it's just typical talking points, and I do like Marshall. We had a great debate, fantastic debate that I recommend everybody go and watch, because we debated for 2.5 hours this topic of ancestry. Is all life related, or is what we see more consistent with separate ancestry? But he says humans are unequivocally apes. So when we look to taxonomy, Matt, as you know, right? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and we look to morphology, anatomy, physiology, and genetics, then the evolutionists say, based on those characteristics, based on that criteria, humans are apes in the same way that humans are mammals. But here's the thing. They want to look to taxonomy and these classification schemes, but they want to ignore the data that we're showing that shows that humans and the great apes, which they say are non-human apes, are not related. So they can say all day that humans are apes based on taxonomy,
right,
but that doesn't change the fact that what? Humans and non-human apes are not related. We see boundaries. It's just not possible. What are your thoughts on that, brother? I know you've spent a great deal of time on taxonomy. So
right. No, I was showing that earlier, that it's they admit from Berkeley itself, they admit that taxonomy is nothing but an assumption based, and the assumption directly comes down to evolution being true based on taxonomy. And I don't know where that is in my slides. Nope, that's not it. But I was showing this earlier, and that's based on the genetic boundary line that the study's talking about. There's clear genetic boundaries, and that would not be there. There's no way that would possibly exist outside of it. But they can believe whatever they want. But I mean, they've been fed this nonsense since school, just like us, right? We took it hook, line, and sinker. It wasn't until we just stepped back and said, let's look at this. Let's look at the bigger picture. Let's stop narrowing in and trying to like really isolate one particular argument. Let's stand back and go, let's look at everything. Like, what are we looking at here? What's the bigger picture? They want to nitpick and be like, well, what about salamander eggs? What are you talking about? What about broccoli? What about broccoli? Man, what are you talking about? Just step back and relax. You know what I mean? It's just like you're hyper focusing on one thing because all the arguments tie together to make the ultimate answer that you don't want to hear. So stop pretending you want to hear the answer. You don't. You just want to go find another question that might trick us because we might not have an answer for you. That's all they've got left.
Well, can you briefly, before we go to the next part of the video, can you briefly go over the taxonomic boundary paradox?
Yeah. That might even be in a folder. Hold on. Yeah, the taxonomic boundary paradox, because Carl Linnaeus, when he first came up with the taxonomic system, he wanted to classify everything, but he was a creationist and he knew that things were separately created. So he came up with like, oh, this is the taxonomic equivalent to this species of animal, right? And so he started naming things and classifying them. And then taxonomy started to being adapted to the evolutionary theory more recently. But because there were boundaries, now in evolution theory, you go back and those boundaries don't exist. Things go from a bear and a dog to a bear dog. Well, that boundary is now gone. Where do you classify that? Well, they have now what's called a taxonomic boundary paradox, because they didn't anticipate that would be something that they would find in the future, that there would be boundaries. And so what happened is when they invented that there were no boundaries, taxonomy became a huge contradiction. And that contradiction was the paradox. And they still have a paradox. That's why they're inventing a new taxonomic system for evolution, because they can no longer use the Linnaeus system as well without running into a problem. That's why Aaron Ross says humans are nothing but evolved monkey fish, because cladistically you can say that humans are apes, but we're also fish, because that goes taxonomically down the line. But there's those boundaries. So they try to remove those. And that's why Aron says we're like an evolved monkeyfish man.
Well, when they draw a circle big enough, they can fit anything into it, right? You could make a circle and title the circle things that breathe air. Well, you're going to fit, or vertebrates, mammals, you know, you can fit anything into that. And that's why from our starting position of separate ancestry, obviously, since what we're looking at is similarities in DNA, RNA, proteins, morphology, anatomy, okay, physiology, then therefore we would safely conclude that God would have created some creatures more similar to each other while other creatures are less similar, okay? And that's what we find, obviously, because we're all made up of the same building blocks. Of course, that's what we would assume and predict. So the question is, are those hierarchies there by descent or design? And that's where, Matt, as we're doing here, we look into the boundaries. We look into boundaries in terms of the fossil record, in terms of genetics. We can look to mutation rates. And what we find is that, for one, the genetic data puts a line in ancestry showing that no, not all life is related, although we can categorize all forms of life into taxonomic categories because we're all made of fundamentally the same building blocks that code for the phenotype, code for the morphology, the anatomy. Okay, this is basic. Like I said, draw a circle big enough and you can fit anything into it. But the thing is, we go into it and we look at the specifics and the details, and the genetics is the best way to determine ancestry, as we're doing here. And that's exactly what we find is boundaries, discontinuities. And we find that no, although we can categorize all forms of life, not all forms of life are related. And they can't deal with, someone like Andrew Cumming just wants to look at the pattern of life, those groups within groups, patterns. But he doesn't ever want to deal with the actual data that suggests that those patterns are there by design and not descent. And that's the problem, is you want to hang out in phylogenetics all day, but then you don't want to deal with the data that shows your phylogenetics is mostly based on assumptions that all life is related, but there's data, empirical data in real time that suggests not all life is related. So the trees are only as good as the empirical data, especially when you're looking to morphology and anatomy in the fossil record. They can look to anatomy and morphology in the fossil record and build any trees they want. But if the genetic data suggests that not all life is related, then I'm sorry, you just have to admit that a lot of these trees are based on built-in assumptions. So I know that was a rant there, but let's go back to the video, brother.
Okay.
And then
I found my taxonomic.
Okay. Yeah. If you wanted to play it, go ahead. Or if you wanted to make a couple more points there.
Sure. Yeah. Real quick. So Carl Linnaeus, his classification basically is what everybody knows as today. He named the Homo species and placed us in the genus Homo, although Linnaeus believed that humans were special beings in God's creation. He slotted our species into the system as if they were any other. So you have to put mankind somewhere, right? And Homo means man. That's where it's Latin. That's why Homo sapien, Homo neanderthalis, right? It's just human. It just means man. So what separated man from their co-inhabitors of the class of primate and the other order of mammals was the mind. This is what he believed. It indicated in a motto of humans and our specific name, Homo sapiens, which means know thyself. So that's something. And then he believed that there were boundaries. And this, what I was saying earlier, he was willing to push the boundaries of what the Bible taught. He believes this is why the taxonomic boundary paradox is now a problem for them. I'm not sure what second Adam is. Let me see. The Swedish naturalist Carl von Linné became known during his lifetime as the second Adam because of his taxonomic endeavors. Sorry, that was just, all this is from my video making. So that's why it's there. Here's where it shows that sloth was in the same taxonomic thing as human beings, as primates, Carl Linnaeus, because before they found primates, humans were classified most related to the sloth. And it wasn't until they discovered primates that it changed. Here we are with bats. Bats are under primates, by the way. and that changed in the 11th edition, but in the 10th edition, we would be calling bats primates. So taxonomy can change. It changes all the time. So because it's subjective, that doesn't make it actually true. So humans are the only member of the genus. I think that was pretty much it. Here's the boundary paradox I was talking about. The term boundary paradox refers to a conflict between traditional ranked-based classification of life and evolutionary thinking. This apparent ambiguity cannot be resolved with the Linnaean system. Resolution is only possible if classification is cladistic. Notice that? You cannot resolve it with his. That's why they're inventing something else, because they can no longer do it with what the theory that they invented. Ape is an English word. So that you can see my video on taxonomy sometime. It's on both of our channels. I recommend watching. It's probably half an hour to an hour. I couldn't get you a link right now because this is on my mind, but I can put it in there after the video or something. You'll like it because it just goes through all of the history showing that it's just made up.
That's a great point, brother. And I want to point out something that Speed of Sound said, which I found was hilarious. So he was pointing out that, okay, we're looking to these hierarchies and we are showing that they are there by design, and we are looking to DNA function. Because one major assumption of phylogenetic systematics, Matt, is that evolutionists assume all DNA differences, all genetic markers, okay, whether they're looking at various pseudogenes, okay, they assume they are the result of what? Mutations, genetic mistakes, evolutionary processes, okay? That's why when you look to these amino acid trees that Dr. Herman Mays looks to say that we're all related, okay? He is assuming what's called neutral variation, okay? He's not even considering functional variation. So the point is, DNA function helps us to differentiate between the models. Hierarchies by descent, hierarchies by design, okay? So Speed of Sound pointed that out. But then he said the problem is most of the genome is still junk, as in a lot of these non-conserved regions are there and they're useless and they're evolutionary leftovers, completely missing the fact that what he's saying contradicts the data that suggests what? Most of the genome is active. And they don't want to make predictions on this activity because they need to maintain genomes of junk. So yes, if we can demonstrate, and the trajectory is strong in favor of genome-wide functionality with some junk and mistakes, of course, due to genetic degeneration, but mostly functional. And therefore, this neutral variation or these so-called genetic markers that they assume are the result of genetic mistakes are actually there for functional purposes. And they have no way to explain the activity, because if all this activity really is spurious, Matt, the question we always ask is, why didn't the cell over millions of years, why didn't natural selection remove all this junk? Because it's wasteful for the cell. So apparently evolutionary mechanisms can take a fish to fisherman. Evolutionary mechanisms can take a single-celled like ancestor into a multi-celled ancestor, into a fish, into an amphibian, into a reptile, mammal, monkey, human. But it can't remove junk. The junk just stays around and it's wasteful for the cell, and it's just
and the body's spending energy. It's using ATP to supply energy to junk. What kind of sense does that make? You know how important ATP is in energy for the body to be wasting on useless material? That makes no sense.
Makes no sense. But I'm going to we're going to go to the next part, because we did do like a 2 or 3 hour video debunking stated clearly on ERVs, where we deal with a lot of, like, for example, Marshall said, the data doesn't say most of the genome is functional. That's just an assumption. So we actually kind of just dealt with a lot of that here. But check out that video, Debunking Stated Clearly on ERVs, and we just absolutely demolished those claims. So that being said, let's go share screen, get through a little bit more of this, brother.
All right.
And okay, here we go. Okay, good. We're at 6 minutes, so
years. It shows a time to most recent common ancestor for that mitochondrial gene within that time frame, but the time to most recent common ancestor is not the origin. The origin is necessarily in the more distant past than the most recent common ancestor. We can illustrate this with this figure. For the origin to equal the time to most recent common ancestor, that would require zero loss of allelic diversity over time, meaning no selection, no drift, inbreeding, any of that stuff. But alleles are lost all the time. Every generation, you lose alleles. So you can't just assume that the most recent common ancestor also represents the origin of the species in question. And we can illustrate this with this figure right here. So in this figure, we're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations of mitochondrial DNA, where the bottom is the most recent, and the top is in the most distant past. And what we see here is, if you look, you can look at the mitochondrial ancestry by color. So the black silhouette right here, that converges. Every individual in the current generation goes back in time and converges right here to this individual in the past. That is the current mitochondrial most recent common ancestor. Now you'll note that she was not the only woman alive at the time. The reason for that, the reason the mitochondrial most recent common ancestor was not the only individual alive at the time, is that other...
Oh, did you want me to pause, brother?
No, sorry. I was.
Okay. I thought I heard.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
Mitochondrial genotypes are lost over generations. So you have all these other colors representing other mitochondrial lineages. And look what happens if you survey from a different generation. What if instead of this generation right here, we had done the calculations based on this generation? Well, you have pink, you have black, and you have orange. And if you go back in time to this generation, you still have pink, black, and orange, meaning the most recent common ancestor is going to be in the more distant past. Because again, the most recent common ancestor is the convergence point for the existing genetic diversity in the past. It's not the origin of the group in question. In order for those two things to be the same, you would need to have zero loss of diversity over generations, and that simply doesn't happen. You always lose alleles over generations through processes like selection and drift. So the first thing that creationists do that's wrong is they conflate this most recent common ancestor with the origin of the different species. The second problem is that the study itself actually...
Is that a conflation we're making real quick before we...
I don't see how it could be. He says mitochondrial Eve isn't just the first woman, but yet he hasn't run the numbers or the math to even figure out what even that's supposed to mean. I've said it in a long time ago. I said, okay, your theory is telling us that what happened is essentially this. This is essentially what evolution believes. Okay. Now, you guys would recognize this. This is a bunch of people alive. And then they went through a bottleneck, and just a few existed over a very long period of time. But they all came from these that survived, just these two people, right? And then another bottleneck hit, and then there's a couple more people. And long periods of time, then another bottleneck hits. These are people over time. You know, this is probably the split, right? About 7.5 million years ago. Then boom, another 200,000 years ago, boom. And then Catawba catastrophe, 75,000 years ago, right? So these are bottlenecks that they say are happening. And then there's these two people. Well, where are the other ones? Where are all these people in the fossil record? Well, they're not there. Where's the genetic evidence for all of these people? Well, those aren't there. Where's the 10,000 women that supposedly only gave birth to what, boys? There's no women. Mitochondrial Eve is only one of her kind, so she has to say, well, there were, you know, the 99 other thousand either didn't have children at all, or they only had boys, and there's no evidence left anymore. That's where that comes from. So if you want to believe that over the most simplistic, obvious one, that the genetic evidence is telling us that there was just a worldwide global bottleneck that wiped out everything fairly recently, I mean, go ahead. I'm not going to tell you, like, I don't care if you believe in evolution, but don't tell us that we don't have evidence for young earth creation, and definitely don't tell us that your evidence is better, because it's not. It's just this good retrofitted data. It's like finding a pin and then making a story about why that pin exists. Sure, you can come up with any theory. It might even sound legitimate. That's what evolution does. So when people go, well, evolution doesn't have evidence. Well, it does. It's got the pin, but it just made the story up. We're explaining why we saw this pin get made. We watched the process because we can see it, and we go, wow, that's how it got made. There's a creator, right? We literally witness fast mutation rates, and they say, no, they're slow, and they're based on phylogeny. And we say, well, why are they fast when we look at them? They are fast. They're fast in everything we've ever tested. We're fast in humans. And the only reason that they could be fast is if it was recent. So see what I mean? The evidence is just better. We have more of it. It's superior. Of course they have evidence, but ours is just so much better because it's observable and predictable. We have a study. We have one where we make multiple predictions. You guys can go falsify it all you want. Here it is. Here's the link. Okay, you can go to creationist clothing if you want, and go invalidation of the evolutionary mitochondrial neutral clock. So you can find it on. I should have left that up so you guys can see the name more. You guys can find it on ResearchGate. You can find it on academia.com. You can find it here on Creationist Clothing. It's everywhere. No one says any. Matter of fact, the two people that were evolutionists that did read it had good things to say about it. So they must not be anti-young Earth creation, because, you know, when as soon as you post it on a young Earth creation site, all you're getting are the Swami Das's and Dans who are like, they're up all night long reading it to try to find anything wrong. These guys are just, they believe in evolution. They read through it and they're like, wow, I never considered that. Thank you for that perspective. That's what they should be doing. Tell me why we're wrong.
And another thing too, don't they, like when they look to these, we dealt with this in one of our Y chromosome videos where Evograd and Erica, I believe, were showing the differently colored people on these graphs that show lineages changing over time. But don't those assume constant sized populations?
Yes, they have to, because without different sized populations, you don't have different rates of substitutions. See, what happens in smaller people groups, mutations reach fixation faster, and therefore they become a locked fixed mutation that you find in the entire population. And that happens quicker in smaller populations. And then over time, they're hoping that they would get weeded out because of evolution. And we say, once they become locked in, that's pretty much how we can count backwards using substitution rates to determine when the most recent common ancestor was, because it's superior than mutation rates. Because as I was saying earlier, you might have a different mutation rate than me based on our generational patterns of when our parents had offspring. So therefore your mutation rate might be a little bit faster than mine. You might have more mutations than me. Africans do, because they constantly generation after generation have faster generation times. So therefore they have more mutations, therefore they look older. And that's a good way to explain the neutral theory and how it's wrong, because they said that we all are going to find the same. As where, okay, here's a door. That door represents a bottleneck. Now, which one of these is older? According to evolution, it's the orangutan, followed by the gorilla, followed by the chimp, followed by humans. And, well, what does the evidence show? Well, it does show that. But how would this explain all coming through a recent bottleneck? How in the world could this one look older than this one, than this one, than this one? Because that is what we see. And now that we know mitochondria was reset at the bottleneck, there's only one way to explain the data. And that is that the orangutan, which has a fast generation time, they have the youngest young around 14 years of age. Then the gorilla, theirs is around 11. When they have a children. Then the gorilla, a little bit older, like 14 to 18 maybe, and then the chimpanzee, and then humans come along. That's why they have different mutation rates and different amounts of fixed substitutions. You would imagine that an orangutan would have a lot more fixed substitutions if it's literally had double the generations as a human being, right? So when you're looking at orangutan, it looks older evolutionarily because they're looking at mutations, which it has more of. So therefore they conclude, well, it must be older. Well, now that we know that the bottleneck reset mitochondria, the only evidence that's left is young Earth creation, because that better explains the data.
Amen. Amen. Well said. And when it comes to these, and it's so funny because these videos we put out where Erica and her 3-hour attack on us tried to refute Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's confirmed predictions, right? In terms of the history of civilization, which Dan hasn't even attempted to address, which is hilarious. Okay. And let me tell you, the professional YECs, the ones making these predictions, they are well aware of the dodging, okay? Because they are well aware of the fact that we have the one-trick pony Dan complaining and yet not making any testable predictions of his own. But most of human history involves population growth rather than these standard methods, right? Where they use a lot of guessing. And it's highly inference based. Okay, they assume a constant population size, then they derive their equations on that basis, and of course modify them if they run into situations of population growth. But this is all clumsy, and Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's method for inferring population growth is not stasis and does not invoke these erroneous assumptions and inferences. And what we find based on his methodology are, and I wanted to just share screen real quick because once again, this just demolishes. Let's see if the phylogenetic experts in the chat can deal with this. Okay, so this is new. And Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, he's put out a couple new presentations that we've watched. They've had a couple conferences, and these evolutionists are so behind. He has now released several papers, several lectures, several presentations demonstrating his successful predictions. We're way past these pathetic arguments that Dodgeball Dan's putting forth. No, we are already in an active research program where successful predictions are the result. And it's only getting better and better and better. So here, in a nutshell, this was months ago, but he goes over his prediction, okay, that traces the origin of nearly all the common DNA variants back to Adam and Eve. My model suggests that the history of civilization can be read off the nuclear DNA differences and the mitochondrial DNA differences, okay? Because you notice that Dan says we ignore the nuclear DNA differences. So Jensen pointed out these movements will leave a signature in the genetics of each people group. Okay, these were predictions. Now he's tested them, okay, specifically on the Y chromosome, okay? And you can read through this. I'll post this paper right here. Since then, I've published 3 papers that directly, notice this. What does that say, Matt?
Directly of predictions for the Y chromosome. Directly confirmed the prediction.
So notice how they are so behind. They can't deal with the predictions and the fact that they're showing themselves to be successful. They either have to, they're the ones invoking a conspiracy saying, well, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's lying. He didn't really confirm the predictions, even though they haven't read the papers and watched the lectures, okay? So he talks about, with this precedent in hand, in spring and summer of 2020, I began to explore the global ramifications of these findings. I looked for the signatures of human history and the DNA of people all around the globe. Because remember, if what we're saying is true, and all of this data, so you want your Dodgeball Dan, okay, which is trying to say that we're ignoring, substitution rates, we're ignoring the role of genetic drift, purifying selection, genetic bottlenecks, whatever, okay? But we are saying, no, we can account for purifying selection. We account for genetic drift. We only have a few DNA differences separating any two people in the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA. Therefore, if what we're saying is true, then we should see a lot of what? Genetic signal. And we should be essentially able to read the history of civilization in these DNA compartments. And that's exactly what we're finding. We're finding more signal than noise. But if what Dan is saying is true, we should find more noise, less signal. But he doesn't want to go out and test that. He doesn't want to go out and make any predictions because he knows that they will show him to be wrong. It's our side that's showing more signal than noise. Because remember, if what he's saying is true and humans and these phylogenetic trees go back a couple 100,000 years, then we should find more noise because the last 4,500 years of human history then would just be the end of a needle, right? And you'd have so much history prior to that these last 4,500 years should just be almost impossible to detect in terms of genetic signatures. But if what we're saying is true and all we do see is between 4,500 and 6,000 years, then we should be able to detect ample amount of signals. We should essentially be able to recreate the history of civilization in our genetics. And guess what? That's exactly what we're doing. That's exactly what we are showing to be true. And the evolutionists have failed miserably to demonstrate it. We've got a paper, brother, you and I, that we put together on our website, also showing predictions, also showing what results from a powerful model. We've had no rebuttals. And that's why people like Dr. Jensen are sitting back, doing their diligence in his active research program, showing these successful predictions, while people like Dishonest Dan are still 2 years ago trying to debunk something that we've already shown is making testable predictions. You get what I'm saying? Like, he's so behind on the data, and the people making the predictions they're just laughing, and they're just like, I mean, are they serious? I mean, the dodgeball is strong, and everything I just said is factual, and they never deal with it. Did you have anything to say? I know that was a rant, but I just had to get that out there.
No, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, they don't like our work, but yet they don't address it. You know, that study that I showed that me and you did, it's 30 pages. You remember David Neff saying, oh, Dr. Jensen's study's only 4 pages. Who only writes a 4-page study? Give us something to work with here. Okay, there you go. 30 pages, buddy. Go ahead.
Right.
Take it away,
Right.
man. I mean, we covered everything in that. We made future predictions. We have retrodictions. We have predictions that even if they don't test them because they don't do a pedigree study, it won't matter because only time will tell. All you have to do is wait, because if evolution is true, well, guess what? The genetic diversity will increase very slowly over time. We won't be able to really see it. But if evolution is true and these mutation rates are fast, we'll literally observe diversity increase within our lifetime. And that's exactly what the CO1 gene is able to do because of its mutation rate and what they're studying to find a new species. So we can look in there and we can make predictions based on the mutation rate. And we can look into the past to see when did the first cats arise. We can go to Egypt and talk about it. And we do all these things. And it's really fun. And that's the one thing that makes us a little bit different. Dan comes along and all he does is complain that we took something from a study that he says he doesn't even like the study. He said that during that interview.
Right.
I don't even agree with that study, but
because it contradicts his belief.
Right.
It contradicts his position.
Right. So, but yet he's still complaining that Dr. Jensen doesn't agree with the study either. So how ironic is that? He's like, I don't agree with the study, but I don't like what Dr. Jensen doesn't agree with it for. What? That doesn't even make sense. It's like saying, anyway, no, I won't even try to think of an analogy for that one.
Well, actually, if you could one more time, because it's so important, right? Because we see the parrot here, right? The living. Actually, you know what? This meme is probably the best evidence I've seen for universal common ancestry, because Dodgeball Dan really does have a lot in common with parrots, right? Which means he must have derived those parrot-like traits from a common ancestor of parrots. So I don't know. I think that might destroy our position. I mean, the way he just parrots the same 3 talking points over and over again. So what I wanted to ask you, brother, the whole substitution rates, not pedigree rates. What do we say about rates of fixation after the flood?
Well, we would say exactly what would we expect to find. You dwindle people down to 8. You're going to have a small population for a while. So fixation, the fast mutation rate that we see, is going to push those mutations to fixation faster than they are now with a population of 7 billion people. Obviously, if I get a mutation and it starts spreading through the population with offspring, it's going to be a very, 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 very long time before there's any fixation reach. But with a small population, it reaches fixation really, really quickly. And how many fixations are there in all of humans worldwide? The highest amount of fixed substitutions is 22 or 24. And the average amount is 8. 8. In the most people on Earth is 8, plus or minus 3. That's the average. So we have 2 bottlenecks. We have the global flood, 8 people, and then they start reproducing. They live up until the Tower of Babel, and then they disperse again into small people groups. So you have 2 areas where the human population dwindled down to, or didn't really dwindle down in one. They just dispersed into people groups where there's small populations of people with fast mutation rate reaching fixation quick. Our substitution rate, with Parsons discovered, and actually a lot of people, is that the substitution rate is going to vary about 1 fixation every 25 generations, up to about 33 to 44 if you go with Howe or Sodial at the 36. But it doesn't matter. All of them, we're able to explain the diversity based on these fast substitution rates that we see.
So my question is my screen sharing, brother?
Yes.
On these trees, okay, we got a mitochondrial phylogeny here. Whoops. And a Y chromosome phylogeny. So therefore, based on what we're saying, Okay, faster rates of fixation after the flood. Obviously, right now, rates of fixation are slow because we're living in a world where people groups are spread out all over the planet. We have 7 billion people on the planet. Of course, most new variants are going to be lost. Okay, but when you got 8 people after the flood, okay, you got rapid and exponential growth. Then when we look to these trees, we only see a few differences, right, Matt? Like you pointed out in both the Y chromosome. And this is what's so funny about these people that are obsessed with these assumption-based methods, right? Like Andrew Cumming, and he's a good guy. We like him. He's just he's not dealing with the differentiating lines of evidence that essentially just refutes his entire argument that he focuses on completely. We have these phylogenetic trees of humans. We only have a few DNA differences separating any 2 people, right? We have explosion from a center point. We have the data that is exactly what we'd expect from our starting point. So the question is this a reflection of hundreds of thousands of years or only a few thousand years? Well, based on what you just said, Matt, in terms of substitutions, fixation rates, which model better explains the data?
Well, ours, because when
Right.
we look at the people groups today and we find that larger people groups in general have lower substitutions within them, it matches perfect. When they've ran those charts and they looked at the Aztec, and they find the data and they're like, look at the smaller people groups has more mutational differences than the bigger ones. It just makes more sense.
Exactly. And this is why we can look at these trees and we can clearly see that this is only a reflection of a few thousand years, right? And the evolutionists want to say, well, the reason why there's so few DNA differences is because of purifying selection and all these things that Dr. Dan, because Dan will say, well, we got to look to the phylogenetic rate, not the pedigree based rate, because they don't like the pedigree rate. They don't like the empirical rate because it's too fast. Well, what's funny is overall, we only have a few DNA differences anyway. So we have more than enough room to account for purifying selection, genetic drift, bottleneck, so on and so forth. And not only that, we're the ones that are able to make the predictions that, okay, not only is the data strongly supporting our position, we're going to make predictions on the history of civilization. This really is a reflection of a few thousand years. Therefore, we should be able to read the history of civilization off of these trees using the DNA genetic markers. And that's exactly what has been confirmed. Dr. Jensen's confirming it right now. We've got a paper on our website that's showing the predictions, and so it's just not looking good for them, Matt. Not looking good for them at all, brother. So maybe we should smash through the rest of this video, make our final comments, and then watch as Dan dodges, ducks, dips, dives, and dodges once again. See, here's the problem: when you're a 2-trick pony like Dan, and you can't go outside of your really hyper specific field, then when we do videos like this, what he does is dodges. He's dodged all our rebuttals because remember, we're throwing too much out that's contradictory to his position and consistent with ours. He can't deal with it. So I mean, he
even has to disagree with his own studies because they match ours. It's horrible. Can you imagine having to do that?
I've had more, right. It's funny because these PhDs actually do worse in debates than your non-PhDs, right? Because the non-PhDs on YouTube actually study more topics to try and work out which model's better, right? So, and I think we clearly seen that, especially on Modern Day Debate last week with Neff and also with Dan. Dr. Stefan Frello I debated a couple years ago, Modern Day Debate, and he literally just had to admit to 90% of my opening statement is creation versus evolution. He's a PhD. He had to admit that 90% of my opening is just outside his field. He can't respond to it. So it's like these PhDs that the non-PhDs we debate, they'll say, well, go ask the PhD, like T-Jump's always saying, go ask a biologist. Yeah, we do ask a biologist. We do ask the geneticists, and they don't have answers. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of an argument is that? You're basically saying you don't even know, but you believe it anyway. What?
Right.
You just admitted you lost the debate right there. You just admitted you don't know the very subject that you're saying you're believing and you're going to refute me on.
Have you ever noticed the double standard? You got someone like Gutsa Gibbon, who we were able to compile a 6-minute video of all the time she had to say she didn't know. Her way of saying she doesn't know to a challenge to her position is what? I'm not a geneticist. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a geneticist. I'm not a geneticist. Those were moments in debates where she didn't have an answer, right? But the evolutionists say, oh, she's so noble. She's just admitting that she doesn't know the argument because she's not familiar with that position and blah, blah, blah. But meanwhile, a young earth creationist could say they don't know once in an entire debate. And what happens? The entire evolutionary live chat just blows up. Oh, the YEC said he didn't know. Oh, he doesn't know anything. Oh, young earth creation's fault. Isn't it funny how the evolutionists could say they don't know 30 times? The YEC says they don't know once, and suddenly the YEC doesn't know anything. Have you noticed that?
Yeah. And what's insane to me is like they're coming out saying, I know that the evolution is true and you young earth creationists are wrong. And then essentially what we say is like, let's get into the genetics. They say, well, I don't know anything about that. You just admitted you don't know anything about evolution then, because you're constantly saying evolution is just change of allele frequency over time. So let's go over that. Well, I'm not a geneticist. Oh, you just proved you have no debate. I'm sorry. That's what we're making fun of. We're not making fun of the person. I would have made a video out of anybody that said that ridiculous thing over and over again. You're refuting evolution and you're admitting you don't know anything about it. That's what you're going to get made fun of. I'm sorry, because that's just stupid. And if people can't see that, if they're thinking I'm mocking the person because they don't know an answer, it's over your head too, and I'm sorry. Then I should put you on the list as well.
Exactly. And I think I'm on, I know I'm screen sharing, but I think you can still see me in the corner. So yes. Behind me, I've got most of our books. I've got some more of our books over on the shelf, but we've got everything we're saying here in more detail. We've got an entire book on mutation rates going through all the different studies. We go into detail on all of these arguments that people like Dan and Swami Das put forth, the TMR4A argument from Swami Das, recombination rate. So you can definitely check out those books too if you want to dig more deep. Those have gone untouched. Matt and I are blessed how many people are loving the content from the books and picking them up and passing them around. So this information is important because it's 2021. It's a great time to be a creationist because this is the best they got. It's pretty sad. So here we go. We'll let Dan bury himself some more, and then we'll make our final comments and start wrapping it up.
Actually shows the opposite of what creationists claim, putting aside all their bonkers math, because they're saying you squeeze the mitochondria down to 6,000 years, therefore origin 6,000 years ago, right? That's what they're claiming. The data in the study itself showed that cannot be the case. You can't have the origins within that time frame. The reason for that is that the mitochondrial most recent common ancestor is going to be more recent than the most recent common ancestor for the rest of the genome. This is because mitochondrial DNA is maternally inherited. It's haploid, so it has a smaller effective population size, N sub E is the symbol for effective population size, than the nuclear DNA, right? The DNA in the rest of your nucleus rather than the mitochondria, which is most of the DNA in your cells is in the nucleus, not the mitochondria. Now, effective population size for our purposes, it's a measure of genetic diversity, right? So if you have a larger effective population size, the convergence point is going to be in the more distant past. Because the nuclear DNA is diploid, it has a larger effective population size than the haploid mitochondrial DNA. So it's going to converge.
Matt, if you wanted to deal with that massive straw man real quick, and I got to run upstairs for about 30 seconds. So yeah, okay. His nuclear DNA argument's just hilarious. If you want to deal with that real quick, brother.
Yep. Go ahead. All right. Let's begin over here with what Wikipedia says, okay? We're going to go up here because the human mitochondrial mutation molecular clock, okay? We're going to be looking at here, mtDNA. It's greatly dependent on the available data and the method used. So there are two different methods, phylogeny and pedigree-based methods. That's all you need to know. That's very simple. There's two of them. They believe that it was a split that occurred. This happened about 6.5 million years ago for this one, right? 7 to 6 million years ago. They're not sure exactly, but close enough. This came out in 1979, and it was based on a famous calculation right here. And all molecular clocks were really based and calibrated off of that reference. then much later came the pedigree method. But let's talk about the two different ones. Pedigree is based off of parent-offspring analysis. It's the observable rate, and it's a deep-rooted genealogy going back as far as you possibly can. Get blood from an individual. Usually it's blood. And then there's the phylogeny-based, which goes off of the archaeological fossil record, and it assumes that there is a most recent common ancestor. It's a reconstruction building based off of evolution being true, and that there was a split 6 million years ago. That's it. This is the only two differences. So is there a difference now between these things? In the present study, we expand our previous analysis of the control region, or the D loop, which divergence in multi-generational LOH pedigrees. The results of our analysis, as well as those from other studies, indicate that there is a difference between the two rates. So yes, there is a difference between what they say and what there is actually going on. Well-designed pedigree studies may be more reliable than phylogenetic approaches. So they're admitting that the ones that we use is better. And guess what? It's rather the phylogenetic rate estimate that may be biased. Interesting. Interesting. So they're admitting that the evolutionary one is probably biased. This is a little bit larger. I might not go through it, but here's the ones that show that the mitochondrial D loop was actually fast, and multiple studies that back it up and defend it. Then we can go. Look at what they say here. These studies should be, in principle, the same. So the pedigree-based methods should produce equivalent estimates of the mutation rate, but they don't. And when they use the anthropologists use the fossil calibration to generate the so-called phylogenetic rate. A phylogeny is a tree showing evolutionary relationships. They took the geological age of fossils from evolutionary branch points and calculated how fast mutations must have arisen along those lineages. So that is the pedigree rate again. So the actual versus the observed, okay? These are totally what refute evolution. So the rate is 10 times faster than the observed phylogenetic studies. Some of them get 20, some 35. It depends on the group of people tested. Now here we go again. Selection is unlikely to be a major factor that underlines the differences between phylogenetic and pedigree divergence rates. Now what is Dan always saying? He's saying that nope, selection is what is making the difference. They're saying no, it's not. It's unlikely that it is. So isn't that interesting? And it's difficult to reconcile with the fossil record. What is their phylogenetic rate, assuming evolution to be true? Isn't that interesting? But guess what? They continue to use it anyway. That's what they say here. Many of the studies continue to rely on phylogenetic analysis of mtDNA control region haplogroup trees derived from rates of divergence, despite the complications that arise from the effects of the marked site variability in the control region. Interesting that you're going to continue to use something that is admitted by you in your own words that may be biased and that you have no fossil evidence record for. And here we're going to find it one more time. The phylogenetically based estimates may be biased downwards if the substitutions are not fully neutral. It's like you can't make this stuff up. It's
nope.
Unbelievable.
It's amazing.
Everywhere you look. Oh, look at this. The suggesting the possibility of an underlying high mutation rate. What a shocker for these poor people. Then we look here. I'm almost done. We find that the mutation rate is approximately consistent per year and largely similar among genes. So not only is it fast in the D loop, where Dr. Jensen's study was, which confirmed the D loop result, the entire mitochondria is, the fragments or the CO1 gene is, and all the other genes that they're testing are as well. So the evidence just keeps getting worse and worse and worse for them. And here's another one. Mitochondrial DNA hyperdiversity may be more common across eukaryotes than currently known. So here we go. Despite their allure, we must sadly conclude that all divergence estimates discussed here are without merit. Our advice to the reader is, whenever you see a time estimate in the evolutionary literature, demand uncertainty. And that is not a young earth creationist That's
No.
it.
How funny is it that all of Dan's rescue devices, in order to explain away the data, fail, even by his own standards from his secular secular sources? And I like what Dr. Rob Carter points out in that what we were showing earlier in terms of the mitochondrial phylogeny, the Y chromosome phylogeny. Dr. Rob Carter points out that the length of some of those branches indicate that some people can literally pick up more mutations in the exact same amount of time. So what this also means is that Dodgeball Dan's assumed evolutionary molecular clock is broken. Dan can't look at the branch lengths and then conclude some type of deep time origin or some type of deep time evolution. So what we see, the data you're going over here, the pattern, it all confirms separate ancestry. And what I love here is I want to share screen real quick and recommend this paper because Dodgeball Dan made a video recently. And we actually just refuted everything in that video here as well. That's why this video was so perfect. And he titled it something like Rob Carter Gets Everything Wrong on Mitochondrial DNA. And yet Dr. Carter has a paper here, okay? Not in a Young Earth Creation journal, Mitochondrial Diversity Within Modern Human Populations. We literally know Eve. We have Eve, okay? And the low variation we have in the mitochondrial DNA, the few DNA differences that separate any two people, is easily explainable from our model, from our starting point. We can make testable predictions that flow from it. Okay, so definitely read. I'm going to link this paper in the description box. I wonder how many times Dr. Dodgeball Dan has published in secular journals on mitochondrial DNA. And another thing, too, is I want to share screen. These rescue devices from Dodgeball Dan, they've been dealt with years ago. They've been recognized years ago. We have, right here's an article that I highly recommend. Dr. John Sanford and Dr. Rob Carter wrote it. And they point out that it is widely claimed that the molecular clock shows that mitochondrial Eve lived about 120,000 years ago. This calculated data has been around for very many years and is very outdated. It is based upon many tenuous and convoluted assumptions, including a mutation rate that is now known to be 10 to 20-fold too slow. By simply correcting for the erroneous mutation rate, mitochondrial Eve would have lived just 6 to 12,000 years ago. Why haven't they corrected the 120,000-year-old date since we have known the correct mutation rate for so long? Our own analysis, which simply assumes a relatively constant mutation rate, indicates that the average modern human being differs from the Eve sequence by only 22 mutations, even assuming a mitochondrial mutation rate as low as 0.1 per generation, even though we know it's closer to 0.5, but we assume a significant, here we go, this is what Dan says we ignore. We assume a significant amount of purifying selection. The most straightforward use of the molecular clock indicates that Eve lived about 220 generations ago. And you can read the same about the Y chromosome as well. And this was years ago. And now we actually have successful predictions that are flowing from this data, which I find fascinating. But you got to watch out for PhDs like Dan who have an investment in refuting or being antagonistic to Young Earth Creation, because he also left a comment on Dr. Carter's video recently on the waiting time problem. And he said, why are you ignoring recombination rates? Recombination rate solves the problem, essentially. And he went over a couple other things. You go and read the waiting time problem paper that Dr. Sanford put out. And I left a big comment. I might do a video on it one of these days, where Dr. Sanford literally deals with recombination rates and how it may help a little bit, but nothing close to what the evolutionists would need in terms of fixating so many new mutations since the split between chimps and humans. So you got to watch out. These guys aren't actually reading the Young Earth Creation technical literature and essentially just trying to hope, I guess, that their viewers just take their word for it and blindly believe it. So looks like we got 2 more minutes. We're going to end it here, brother. And let's see, make sure that you can hear
in the more distant past. This is a necessary consequence of the relationship between the mitochondrial DNA and the nuclear DNA. We can illustrate how this works. So in this simple representation, we have many generations here, right? And the bottom is the present again, and the top for each diagram is the past, right? Now, the width at the bottom indicates the effective population size. We have mitochondrial DNA, and then we have greater effective population size for nuclear DNA. As you go from the bottom of the triangle to the top, it gets narrower. That represents the convergence, right? You're taking your current level of diversity, and you're working backwards until you have a common ancestor sequence. Now, for mitochondrial DNA, creationists are saying, well, this study is about the mitochondria. We can make the mitochondria fit into a 6,000-year box. They incorrectly claim that this convergence point is 6,000 years in the past, and also incorrectly claim that that convergence point represents the origin of the species in question. Both of those things are wrong, but let's ignore that for now. If that is the case, then you hop over to the nuclear DNA. You don't converge 6,000 years in the past. It's going to be way further in the past because of your larger effective population size. This means that we could assume that the young Earth interpretation, I'll be polite and call it interpretation, the young Earth misrepresentation is correct for the mitochondrial DNA stuff. We can just ignore all the problems, ignore the misrepresentations. We can just say, fine, that's all correct. The rest of the genome disproves the conclusion they are claiming you get from the mitochondria, because if the mitochondria converged 6,000 years ago, the rest of the genome is going to blow right by that limit, way, way out to beyond a young Earth time frame. And for that reason alone, everything creationists say about this study is wrong, even if you ignore all the other problems. So to summarize, creationists claim this.
Okay, that's enough of Dodgeball Dan. So that's his pretty much the whole video is just going to summarize some of his misrepresentations and straw man arguments. So as you can see, they're pretty sad. It's so funny. This same argument that's already been dealt with even years ago by Nathaniel Jensen against Dr. Herman Mays, who misrepresents his position. They assume all DNA differences in the nuclear genome are the result of mutations over time. They assume that the ultimate source of genetic variation is what? Mutations over time, okay? But we have plenty of evidence that suggests that our starting point of created nuclear heterozygosity is the better starting point. It fits the data. We see forward-thinking mechanisms in our genetics. The epigenome demonstrates forward thinking, points us back to a forward thinker. We've made predictions from this model concerning DNA function, concerning speciation rates. We've got video upon video upon video, including rates of recombination that refute Dan's point there. He's misrepresenting. He's using a straw man argument. We point to the uniparentally inherited DNA compartments like the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, because we can agree with the evolutionists that for the most part, these are the result of mutations over time. And therefore we can use those mutations to track back time, track migration patterns. And guess what? It fits our model. Okay. So his whole argument that the nuclear DNA goes back even further assumes his starting point of mutations over time rather than design diversity. I'm going to let you give your final rebuttals, final thoughts, brother, in terms of what he just said there and also just the bigger picture of it all. So go ahead, Matt.
Oh, wow. You kind of summed that up. That was pretty good. I don't know. I would just say this is, there you go. That sums it up. They're related. Bananas and whales. They're related. You just have to follow that nuclear DNA that he's talking about far back, and that's what you're gonna get. It's uncanny. You know, well, first of all, he's saying that selection weeds out these mutations. So he's got an excuse for the mutation rates when it comes to mtDNA. But yet when he's saying that the nuclear DNA is better because it goes back further, he didn't notice that he doesn't have a problem anywhere with nuclear DNA. He's like, okay, those rates are perfectly fine. They're perfectly fine because they go back further than the young Earth creation model. He knows what young Earth creationists say about nuclear DNA. He just leaves that out of his video because otherwise he wouldn't have an argument. He also, let's see.
Oh, by the way, before you say that, so this is actually real-time footage of Dr. Dodgeball Dan reading the creationist papers that he's trying to debunk. So I think the reason why he's misrepresenting them is because he hasn't yet figured out that he needs to take the blindfold off. Our brother in the chat here made a good point. Yeah, right here. So he says, I think Dan even said that they totally ignored recombination in the paper. Yeah, he doesn't read the papers that he tries to refute because right off the bat, right when I seen his comment on Dr. Carter's waiting time problem video, I went into the paper that Dr. Sanford put out, scrolled right to the recombination section where he discusses it. And then Dan tried to do damage control. Well, I mean, but where's the numbers and this and that? And I mean, it's sad. But here's the thing. We're dealing with a man who pushes pseudoscientific propaganda any chance he can get on every topic he can get. He's not a guy who's actually looking at this with an open mind. I mean, this is a guy who literally denies the science of genders. I mean, this is a man who is the walking billboard for pseudoscientific propaganda. So we're not expecting him to actually look at this with an open mind. He's invested. He can't admit that his belief that he went to school for years and years that banana plants and whales are related is false. He can't admit that. Way too much on the line. But
yeah, his teaching job would be over.
Yeah, go ahead, brother.
No, his teaching job would be over.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
So instead, he has to do this: dodge, duck, dip, dodge all over the place. And what's awesome, I mean, he's so irrelevant. We've had a great show tonight. We've had like over 60 people in the chat seeing what a fraud Dan is, how weak his arguments are, and this is the best they got. So he can still go and he can repeat his same talking points over on his channel, and he can have his few viewers think that what he's saying is the truth. But it's clear to most people that he's got nothing. He's got nothing, and all he can do is cry about it, play the victim card. Well, it's been months and months and months, and he still hasn't presented one actual prediction. Nothing but complaints. Yeah, go ahead, brother.
Well, I was at that video as well, and Dan was in the live chat, and he was pestering the young Earth creationists. He said Carter's doing his usual. He's ignoring substitution rates, and he's talking about mutation rates. Why is he saying that? Because he knows Dr. Carter's not there. It's just a posted video that they premiered, and this is on Genesis's history. And then you can see in the live chat Dan posting all of his comments, and he's like, "They're just talking about mutation rate, not substitution rates. You know, it's more of this." And then what happens is you hear that, and then anybody that's listening would be like, "Oh, I don't even know what that means. He must be true. He's a science teacher." But in reality, we didn't get that from Carter got those numbers from substitution rates. Matter of fact, Parsons was one of the first people to discover substitution rates, went back 6,500 years ago at a rate of one substitution every 33 generations. He ran the test twice in 1997 and 1998. And here was a reply that he gave to us saying that if he did his study again today, the results would be the same. So why would he even bother doing it? So that's ironic. What else? I don't know. Just Dan seems really desperate. In conclusion, what I think is funny is that he doesn't like Jensen's interpretation of the study, but he doesn't like the interpretation of the study either. That's funny. I mean, that's a pretty weird one to me. I'm surprised he even put that in his own video. That like, I don't agree with the study, but let's talk about why Jensen's wrong with his interpretation of the study. Anyway. Oh yeah, he ignores Y chromosome every time, every chance you can get. I mean, there's not much of a difference between mutation rates when you're dealing with Y chromosome and mitochondria. You can still read the data, and you can say, okay, well,
he tried to do it with his blind rebuttal. Remember, that was probably the most fun we ever had. So go check out my refutation of Dan's so-called blind rebuttal to a video we put out on Young Earth creation, Y chromosome mutation rates. It's in the description box in the playlist. I mean, you're right. He ignores it completely, ignores the predictions, and just repeats the same thing. Phylogenetic rate. So yeah, keep going, brother. I just wanted to point that out.
No, it's crazy. It's always the same. It's always the same. You guys don't have any answers. And it's like, you guys, you're just ignoring that we have an answer to this. It's like, no, we know your answer. You've told us 1,000 times. You apparently don't hear us, but yet we keep hearing you. These genetic boundaries that you're alluding, that saying they don't exist in taxonomy, in genetics, in biology, in mutation rates. I don't know what else you want. How many more places can these even exist? Even baraminology, right? I mean, we have now those exact boundaries that the very thing that they're saying that don't exist and that we need to prove exist. Right here, detecting created kinds. This is it. The goal of baraminology is to determine or at least approximate the boundaries and members of many different baramin. Baramin, created kind. Bara. That's it. That's where that comes from. This is accomplished through detection of holistic. Basically, what they're doing is they're looking at something like a bear, and you pull up bears and you say, how many things do they have in similar to one another? But instead of looking at just similarity, how many differences are there between all of the species of bears? So they run the numbers and they go, well, there's about 15 differences most, probably between the panda and this thing. And they'll go, okay, well, anything more than 15 is outside of the species. But how many differences can there possibly be before they actually, are they a monobaramin? Are they holobaramin, which is exactly the thing that they wanted, which is the closest to the created kind that there could possibly be? Or are they an example of an apobaramin? So we have these different things that we can categorize and we line them up. They've done it with dinosaurs. We had that guy on, Matthew McLean. He did it with dinosaurs to determine which were the created kinds. So as you can tell from brontosauruses, let's just look at long necks. These long neck dinosaurs all look the same to us. We would say, well, they're all the same kind. Well, he ran it and actually they're not. They're all the same kind. He found there were two distinctly different kinds of dinosaurs with long necks. And then we go into it right here, which is a single created kind for all the stegosauruses. And we would think these would be different because look at the variety, look at the differences in some of these things. They look like they might be a lot different, but nope, they were all very different. So we can do it with humans and apes. How many differences are there? Well, look at that. There's more than 15 just in this thing that we made. So guess what? When they run the thing to determine holobaramins, guess what? Each thing, it shows exactly the category that you would expect to find. You don't expect to find boxes in evolution, but we do, because evolution is not true. And what do we find? Look at that. Orangutans, all related. Gorillas, all related. Chimpanzees, all related. All humans. Oh, they said these aren't all humans. These are subspecies of humans, but yet here they are, all related. Ironic that the very thing that they say we can't identify, the Aaron Ross phylogeny challenge, is directly answered. It's been answered for quite a while, actually.
Yeah, I was going to say that. It's been, we've literally written books and books that we have behind us answering that, showing boundaries, showing separate ancestry. And to everything you just said, Matt, to everything you just said, it's false because substitution rates, not pedigree rates.
Right.
The two-trick pony is spoken again. So what you said is beautiful. Yeah, I mean, we literally find, I mean, you got R.J. Downer, who's constantly talking about the therapsids. Okay, the mammal-like reptiles are so irrefutable. It demonstrates universal common ancestry. Then we have an expert on the show, shows discontinuities in therapsids, in the Dinosauria, like you just demonstrated, discontinuities in the fossil record. We have genetic boundaries as well when it comes to mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome, nuclear DNA, which means genetics and fossils are on the side of what? Separate ancestry. Dan can't deal with it. And guess what? This genetic boundary study, Matt, has been out for a long time. We've been talking about it for a long time. We've discussed it in debates numerous times. So he's had how long to prepare a video for this?
A long time. Remember, I debated Erica on that very subject.
Mm-hmm. And this was the best he came up with. What does that say about the strength of our model and how weak their model? Like, months and months and months to prepare that.
I know.
And how easily dismantled it was.
Yeah. I mean, that's his best argument, is that he doesn't like the study, but he's not going to tell us why he doesn't like the study. He's not going to tell us that the study is wrong and that they discovered that there was a global bottleneck that killed everything, just like we said Noah's flood would have done, because a volcano sure can't kill anchovies in the deep Pacific if it went off in Asia. And then all of a sudden, you know, everything goes through a bottleneck, comes out, genetic diversity is reset, exactly what we would predict. There's diversity. Every species was created from that point on that we see in the world today. Even in the evolutionary standpoint, that's unheard of. That would mean that in 200,000 years, all the species that are alive today came from that right there. So that doesn't line up with evolution at all. So, but they had already committed to that 200,000 year date with humans. So they have to now do that with animals. And unfortunately for them, they don't believe that the mutation rate is the same in all things going back to that time period. So they're fighting their own science at this point, and they have no evidence in their fossil record for what they admitted happen genetically, they can't prove geologically or paleontology. So we can in all forms, because we explain why the geologic record is the way that it is. We believe that the KT boundary is the line that separates where the flood ended, because the KT boundary was laid down because of volcanism that was set off because of the flood. We explain the genetic boundaries. We explain it through the mutation rates. We literally have answers for all of these things, and they say we don't have answers. We have better answers than they have for theirs.
Well said, brother. Well said. The last thing I'll say before we wind it down, if you're interested in more of this, this is one book with two variants that Matt and I put together, Independent Origins Handbook. Okay, this is the book that it's everything we're talking about for the most part in a nutshell, the biblical model of ancestry. This is the book you'll want to hand out to, the laymen or people at church, or, this is a book that I immediately gave to my parents. People just get a brief overview of the topic, of course, showing how strong our model is, gives them basic talking points, basic lines of evidence that confirm separate ancestry, also arguments, basic arguments debunking the critics' responses. These ones are a little bit more advanced. Special creation, dismantling, evolution, confirming independent origins. In this, you'll find all the refutations of all the technical refutations of people like Dodgeball Dan, Herman Mays, Swami Das, right, Matt? This is where we go heavily into the technical responses. This is another one. This one specifically refuting the critics of biblical creation. Okay, so this one, same thing. This one is heavily packed with sources and quotes from what I think are a lot of the best papers and technical articles from CMI, AIG, ICR, all in one, that we haven't seen the critics even come close to addressing. This one, brother, as you know, the true story of mutation rates, going into all of these mutation rate studies in detail. So guys, this has all been dealt with. All we're dealing with here are the same talking points, one or two trick ponies over and over again. So it's 2021. Be confident, okay? Because it's such a great time to be a biblical creationist. Every year, more and more data comes out that confirms our model. And Matt and I are pretty much working 24/7 on this because it's addicting. The evidence is amazing. It's so much fun. And we want to do our best to bring this information to you. And you guys in the chat have been great. Thank you so much, Ramen. I appreciate that. And Godzilla Freak says recycling can man, Dan. Yeah. If that's the best they got, it's pretty sad, guys. So thank you so much, Ramen, for all the support, brother. Tomorrow we've got Professor David McQueen back with us here. 2-hour special event, a Q&A, everything geology, flood related. So today we hit the genetics hard, the fossil record hard. Tomorrow we're going to get into geology. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And like I said, we got a lot of great shows planned for you guys over the summer. Matt, thanks for doing this, brother. You're a beast. You killed it. Great information. This is rewatchable. Share this around, everybody in the live chat. Any last words, Matt, man?
Just think about it, guys. This is what they believe, like complete relation. But think about it. Why would you share 50% of your DNA with a banana? Is it because you're related to one, or is it because God used the same material to create things in life? Why would he create a banana so different than all other life forms that they shouldn't be related to some degree? I mean, how many amino acids are there? How many coding regions are there? I mean, there's not a lot of things here, right? There's only a certain amount of minerals, only a certain amount of vitamins, only a certain amount of amino acids. So of course you're going to share things with something else. It's obvious. It's not because you're related in the deep past. It's because the same book was written with the same letters written in the same language. So of course you're going to see similarities. It's like picking up two different books and going, I can't believe it. These books must be related to one another. Look at the words. Some of them are identical. The letters are all the same too. These books must be related to one another. It's like, well, no, same designer. Humans wrote these books. That's it.
It's so simple, brother. It's so simple. So well said. Great stuff. Matt and I should be done the R and Raw video, hopefully within the week. We promise you it's going to be irrefutable, undeniable proof that R and Raw doesn't know what he's talking about. 3 hours, and we'll premiere it on both channels, guys. So something to look forward to. I think I got the promotion thumbnail for it right here. Yeah. Oh yeah. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Matt, the #1 editor on YouTube. I promise you, I've seen a lot of it, and it's awesome. You're definitely going to want to pass it around. So it's just as good as that flood video that's at 600,000 or 700,000 views. So anyways, guys, it's been a lot of fun. A couple hours already, Matt. I think it's impossible, Matt, for us to go 1 hour. So whatever. We tried. We realized it ain't possible. So yeah, it's too much fun. Too much. See, here's the thing. When you got people like Dan saying more things wrong in one sentence than words that are in that sentence, of course, we're going to have to go at least 2 hours, even on a 12-minute video. So that being said, brother, great job. Great information. God bless. God bless the chat. SFT and Matt Man are out.